All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting in-depth review. As a quick reminder, if you do enjoy this stuff, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon to turn notifications on. All those things are super important. Now, today, we are going to be doing an in-depth review of the new Power Rangers RPG Sourcebook, Stink, Beneath the Helmet. And yes, I was late enough that I actually have my physical copy before doing the review, but I will still be using the PDF copy because it's just easier for me. So, as a reminder, my in-depth reviews are exactly that. They are in-depth. I talk about the things that I like. I talk about the things that I don't like. I talk about the things they did well. I talk about the things I think they need to do but better. And I go in-depth. Sometimes I go chapter by chapter, even going page by page. And that can take a long time. So I like to start off each one of these in-depth reviews by just giving a brief overview of should you buy it. Nobody wants to, or a lot of people don't want to sit through like a 2-hour long video just to figure out if they want to buy it. So I separate potential buyers into 3 different groups. The first group is players. Players are people that are primarily, not exclusively, but primarily going to be sitting at a table and playing a single character. The second group is GMs. GMs are going to be primarily, not exclusively, primarily going to be sitting at the head of the table or wherever the GM sits, and they're going to be running the game, playing all the NPCs, all the threats, things like that. The final group, which I think tends to be overlooked a lot, is what I call lore hounds. Lore hounds may never sit down at a table, but they're really interested in the world and the lore behind the RPG system. And obviously they have different wants and needs than the other 2 groups. So, should you buy this? Well, let's find out. The first group, should players buy this? So, again, this is a source book, so it's going to have a decent amount of new player options. So, obviously, in that realm, sourcebooks tend to be, especially this particular sourcebook, tend to be really popular with players because it gives them more cool stuff that they can do. The specific things that they add in here, there's some new origins, there's some new influences, and then they actually have one brand new role, the Dark Ranger, and then they have 2 alternate roles, which I find is really, really interesting. Basically, we have the Aqua Ranger and the the Graphite Ranger, and they are basically kind of reskins of Blue Rangers and Silver Rangers. And because Silver Ranger isn't in the core book, they've actually reprinted the Silver Ranger, which was originally printed in the space book, Across the Stars. So the interesting thing about the alternate sets is they're very similar to in D&D 2nd edition. They had these things called kits, where basically they would allow you to play like a fighter or something, but they would remove some of the aspects of the fighter and replace them with different things to make the character play differently. And that's effectively what these alternative roles are, is they do use some of the base features from the role that they are modifying, but they will specifically say this replaces this particular perk. And it's really, really interesting. There is also a lot of just new mechanics that they're introducing here. That, again, one of my biggest problems I have seen just with RPGs in general is the idea of rules bloat, where every new source book introduces a new mechanic or something like that. Essence 20 is getting there. This one introduces a couple of new things. There's now this thing called team bonuses. So in addition to having, stuff from your origin and stuff from your influence and stuff from your role, now you also get special abilities just from your specific Power Ranger team. And they do explain where this comes from, and it actually has precedent in the TV show itself, where when you look at things like SPD, all of the SPD Rangers had special powers outside of their morph form. Dino Thunder was the same way, where becoming a Power Ranger's changed how everything worked. So in that aspect, again, getting this book, there's going to be a lot more things you can do. They also introduce the idea of Energems and Dino Chargers, which are complicated. We'll talk about a little bit more when we get to Chapter 3, where it talks about them in detail. But for the most part, it's effectively a way to add additional grid power that has a physical form. Like the Dino Chargers themselves each give you one additional grid power, and you can have up to 4 Dino Chargers on your character, but they're physical items, so theoretically you could forget them in your backpack, or one of the bad guys could steal them from you, things like that. So it's not like the rest of like personal power points that you have in the Power Rangers RPG, where it's just something built into you. These are physical things, but they're spent the exact same way. And they're generally recharged kind of similar. It's a little more complicated than that. So because of all that, there is a lot of stuff here for players. And the physical version is only $45, which is, I think, kind of par with most of the Essence 20 books. That tends to be around the price point that they like. And so what that means is for the $45, you're getting a lot of different things. There's also some new equipment stuff. There's new battleizers. They finally bring shields into Power Rangers, because shields have existed in they've introduced shields in other Essence 20 books. I think the first one showed up in G.I. Joe. So official rules for how shields work in that. There's also new Zord features, and like there's just a lot in here. And that's all in the first 3 chapters. Chapters 4 and 5 are pretty much exclusively for GMs. So when I say that this is a resource-heavy book, I mean it. There is a ton of stuff in here. So as far as should players buy it, the only caveat I have is because of how many new character options are in here, this can very quickly turn your Power Rangers game from kind of some light role-playing stuff to a very mechanic-heavy RPG with a lot of different things that you have to kind of juggle. So the only reason I wouldn't recommend this book to players is if you're already starting to feel like the Essence 20 system is getting a little more complicated than you'd like. Otherwise, there's so much stuff in here that it's hard not to recommend it for. Like I said, $45 is a great price for it. The PDF is only $30, so if you don't want the physical version, again, I always get the physical version, because if you pre-order it or shortly after ordering it, you can get a free PDF for getting the physical. And as of the time of me recording this, it is 12:21 a.m. on the 11th of May. As of me recording this, they are still listing that you get the PDF free. That will go away eventually. I don't know how long it takes for that to go away. So if you want to get both of them for one price, you'd want to pick them up soon. But my recommendation for players is definitely pick it up. The physical version is worth it. The digital version is definitely worth it. Just understand there is a lot here. Moving on. The second group. Should GMs buy this book? So, anytime we have something that has a lot of player options, recommending it for GMs becomes a little bit more complicated, because if your players want to use these options, you're going to have to get the book anyway, because you're going to have to understand how to use all these new players' options. So from that, just that standpoint, GMs are probably going to want to get this book if their players are interested in it. Now, that being aside, there is a lot here for GMs. Like I said in the other section, chapters 4 and 5 are entirely written for GMs, and they have a lot of really good stuff in there. They have, like, chapter 4 is basically a how-to guide on how to write plots that don't involve giant monsters stomping through Tokyo, and how to create interesting tension and storylines that don't involve saving the world. You know, how do you mix in the mundane world of, you know, finals and detention and stuff like that, when you also have to balance that with the world ending and, you know, things like that. So that's really, really useful. But there's also a bunch of other things here. Things like they have an entire section on creating a home base. And they have a bunch of different versions of home bases. Like the command center is a different home base than like Haley Cyberspace Cafe from, I think that was Dino Charge. Or if you go to Jungle Fury, they had the pizza place. Or Mystic Force had 2 different kind of home bases, which they mentioned here. You might have a couple different ones. The original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, they had a home base that was the command center, but the command center was really bare bones. So a lot of times when the Rangers wanted to meet up and they didn't want to be in the command center, they would meet up at Ernie's Juice Bar. And so they have all these different tools that you can use to kind of design your own hangout place. Like for my mini campaign that I ran, we started, like, they had a command center, but we also started showing the idea that Fun Buns, which was definitely not Cinnabon, Fun Buns was going to be kind of an alternate base, because one of the player characters worked there, and the rest of them would kind of like hang out there every so often. So, you know, that in and of itself is really nice and really useful. There's an entire section on motivation, which is very useful for players, but it's also very useful for GMs to be able to understand how motivation works as far as player choice and character choices. And then again, there's a bunch of new systems here. There's even a system for kind of alternate versions of your Megazord. Because let's say like one of the Rangers, you know, can't get their Zord for whatever reason. Their Zord's been disabled or something like that. They have rules in there for having an alternate version of the Megazord that maybe uses less Zords. Which is fine, and I think that's perfectly great. What I was kind of hoping we would see here, which I guess really didn't show up a lot until Ninja Steel, but in Ninja Steel they had a bunch of different versions. I guess it was kind of, they had that kind of in Mystic Force too. But they had a bunch of different versions of the Megazord, where I particularly liked it in Ninja Steel, because whichever kind of Zord was sitting in the like center spot for the Megazord would change how the Megazord worked. And I just thought that was a really interesting way to have a Megazord where you could have like different flavors of the Megazord for different situations. And I really like that. That's not what alternate Megaform combinations is really designed to do. I'm certain if we do get a Ninja Steel Sourcebook, they will probably introduce rules that allow you to do that, or maybe even, like I said, I thought Mystic Force also had some kind of different flavored Megazords, or when we go all the way up to what was it, Dino Fury, and then the sequel to Dino Fury that I can't think of, Cosmic Fury. There we go. Cosmic Fury had, like, as much as the Megazords in and of themselves were really underutilized in Cosmic Fury because of how much they cut the show down. They did kind of had the thing where, like, different combinations of different Zords would come up with a different Megazord and things like that. So yeah. And then obviously there's new threats and everything. Threats are always useful in general. The other thing that's really nice about Chapter 4, where they're talking about all the different ways to come up with storylines that don't involve monsters, is they do have some really good just overall storytelling advice. Things like show, don't tell, stuff like that. So there's a lot of really, really good stuff in here. Again, for a $45 price point, it's not it's not really a question. There's a ton here. Yeah, even if you're not playing Power Rangers specifically, there's enough here for GMs that they could take a lot of the stuff that they learn here and use it in any of the other Essence 20 games, or just in running RPGs in general. Like, there's a lot of just kind of universal advice in here. So yeah, overall, definitely recommend it for GMs, either physical or digital. They're both great. Moving on. The third group. Should lore hounds buy this? This is kind of weird, because generally something that Renegade does remarkably well, specifically with their Essence 20 books, is they are really good at blending lore and mechanics. Generally, everything that is done in here mechanically has a lore explanation as to why that is happening. So in that particular aspect, there's lots of lore in here for lore hounds to read, at least in the first 3 chapters. All the player option stuff, there's a decent amount of lore. However, because this is such a feature-filled book, in order to fit all of it into less than 200 pages, this, I believe, tops out a little over 162, 64, somewhere around there. There is lore for just about everything in here. It tends to be relatively short. There are some sections where there's a lot of lore, but because there's just so much mechanics in here, the lore starts to get a little bit dry. And then there's a lot of just kind of advice on how to play RPGs in general. So this one, there's not quite as much lore as I would want to be able to recommend it fully to lore hounds. There is a decent amount, but it's nothing like the Across the Stars, where there's just tons and tons of lore in there. So as far as, and then obviously the threat section, each threat has its own little spiel talking about what they are and how they do. So that's always really fun for lore hounds. So overall, do I recommend the physical? Your mileage may vary as a lore hound. I think $30 for the digital will give you a decent amount of lore to kind of look over, especially the artwork and everything in here. $45 plus the additional like $10 or $15 for shipping, depending on where you are, turns this into a bit expensive for lore hounds. If you can find it without having to pay for shipping, like through Amazon or something, it might be good. Or if you go to your friendly local game store, you can get a deal on it. I might recommend the physical version, but for the most part, I think you'd be just as fine doing the digital and won't feel quite as much of a financial investment that you're hoping to recap by having lots of really interesting lore to read. So, yeah, moving on. So, quick recap. For players, I recommend both the physical or the digital. There's so much in here that it's definitely worth it. Same thing for GMs. There's so much in here that it's worth it for either physical or digital. For lore hounds, it's a little bit lore light. It's not devoid of lore, but there's so much mechanics in here that it does kind of push some of the lore out. So maybe think about getting the digital or finding a way to get the physical on sale or somewhere you don't have to pay for shipping, because that gets a little bit more expensive than I can recommend. So, yes, for those of you that were just here to get a recommendation on whether or not you want to pick up this book, thank you so much for tuning in the comments down below. Let me know what is your favorite alternate style of ranger. Do you like things like the Spirit Rangers from Jungle Fury, or the 11 billion Rangers that exist in Dino Charge and Super Charge? Let me know what you think about those in the comments down below. Now, it is time for the in-depth review. As a reminder, my in-depth reviews are exactly that. They are in-depth. I go chapter by chapter, sometimes page by page. I talk about things I like. I talk about the things that I don't like. I talk about the things I think they did well. I talk about the things I think they could have done better. And this one is no exception. It is going to be very, very, very full of different things that I have to talk about. Basically, every couple of pages they introduce something new. It does get very, very confusing. So, yes, that being said, I think it's time for us to go into this in-depth review. The first section, Introduction. Every single Essence 20 book has an introduction section, and they're actually really nice. They will go chapter by chapter and basically explain the basics of the chapter. They reprint the rules for contacts in here. If you're unfamiliar, contacts were first introduced, I want to say, in the Across the Stars Sourcebook. But it might have been one of the G.I. Joe books. Someone feel free to correct me in the comments down below. But basically, they're a way for NPCs to basically come in and help the players in particular parts. Not because the DM or the GM is kind of putting them in Deus Ex Machina style, but it's an actual system that allows them to be rewarded for befriending certain contacts. It's a really nice system. I really, really love it. And they just reprint the rules for getting contacts. I don't know why they have that in the introduction. They do have some new contacts in here, but they're a really small part of the book. So, yeah, I know contacts have shown up in other Power Rangers systems, and to me it would make more sense for them to put the contacts rules next to the actual contacts that will show up. So yeah, maybe it was just a layout thing where they thought that section was just too heavy already, but it's a weird decision. But yeah, for the most part, that's all the introduction is. Some really cool artwork, and then, the contact section. So, not a whole lot to talk about here. Moving on. Chapter 1. Band of Heroes. This is such an interesting chapter because it would be very easy to label this chapter as basically, new player options. But it's not just that. And the first thing that they do, the first subsection here, is called Narrative Ties. And it's basically talking about what can you do to create kind of a narrative tie between the group. You have your one thing, the thing that makes your ranger unique. Shared threads is a modification of something that I learned years ago. And I don't even know where I learned. I was at a convention somewhere, but it was basically during character creation or during your first game. This was before Session 0 was the gold standard, that if you don't have one, then you must be trying to burn people alive or something. But it was basically kind of encouraged at your first session, and now it would be at your session 0, to basically turn to each player and go, what is one connection that you have to another character at the table? And you would basically go around and everyone have connections. Shared Threads is a modified version of that, where it starts off with you look at one player and go, pick a shared thread with someone else, and they give some examples of different kinds of shared threads, like these two might be rivals, or these two might be close friends, or have a shared stress, or something like that. But the system itself is designed so that everybody has, I think it's you go around until every character has 2 shared threads, and so one person will what do you call it? Pitch a shared thread, and then the player that is running the character that they want to have the shared thread with will kind of negotiate it down to, this is something that I'm excited about. So that in and of itself is kind of really interesting. And then it goes into world ties, where you need to come up with a reason for you to care about the world that you live in, which is really interesting, and they give a few different examples there. And then mission, motivation, and enemies is basically helping you to define why you're fighting, what are you fighting for, like what's your end goal, do you have rules that you follow, and what gets in your way, what are the things like that. So it's really designed to give you a much more fleshed out world to live in. And so and again, that is within the first 3 pages of this chapter. They have narrative ties, world ties, and then your motivation and the things like that. So just in those first 3 or 4 pages, there is a lot of stuff there that will massively change how your players view your game. If you're just coming into it of, I've got a really cool character and I want to, do cool stuff in a Megazord. And now it's like, well, your character is an activist that's fighting to save the planet, and the bad guys are trying to pollute it and stuff like that. Like, there's lots of stuff. And you are rivals with this character, but you have a secret crush on this character. And it's really, again, it's my biggest, not really complaint, I guess it is a complaint, with this book, is they put so much stuff into this book that it gets overwhelming really, really quickly. Like when I read it the night I got it, I read through the whole thing, and I could not absorb everything. I was thinking about making my in-depth review that night, and it just wasn't going to happen. So I put it down, I go to bed, a few days pass, I come back to do the in-depth review today, and I had to read through the entire thing because there's so much there and my brain doesn't remember things. And reading through it, I had a tiny little panic attack because I was just so overwhelmed with all the stuff that shows up here. So right after we're done dealing with motivations and connections, they introduce a brand new system called team bonuses. And they don't really explain the why. They explain what team bonuses are, but they don't explain the why. Why are you adding this new system? What, if you're not playing like the Dino Rangers, if you're playing a game that's based off of like old Power Rangers, do you need to retcon a team bonus into it? How does this work? And they do have an example team bonus for the Dino Rangers, which is the Dino Charge Rangers, and then the Mighty Morphin Rangers, they have their own team bonus, and it's not particularly well explained here why they just kind of shoved this in here and added this new system that I don't really think needs to be there. And they also kind of try to put team bonuses, they try to kind of piggyback it on the form perks. Form perks are something technically that have existed since the core book, but they weren't called that in the core book. But from the first expansion to the Power Rangers RPG, they started introducing form perks, which is basically, it was a general perk that you could to choose. Or it was either a general perk or a grid power. I can't remember which. Anyway, it was a perk that you could choose on level up that when you morph, you could burn a little bit of personal power to morph into a different form that would give you different abilities and different cool stuff. The original form perk, which again isn't called a form perk and retroactively is turned into a form perk, was ninja powers effectively. So now the team bonuses are kind of a version of form perks, but they're a version of form perks that you get without having to actually take a form perk, because you don't get your first perks until around either level 4 or level 6, depending on whether it's general or grid powers. So these are designed to be right from the beginning, and like I said, it's more confusing than it needs to be. And again, I would have much rather seen team bonuses either introduced in a different section and given more length, or just introduced in a different book entirely, because the team bonuses are for the most part primarily morphed bonuses. You don't get them when you're not morphed, with some exceptions. And so because of that, it doesn't make sense that in the Beneath the Helmet Sourcebook, which is supposed to be about non-morphed stuff, they introduce an entirely new mechanic for morphing. So yeah, not particularly fond of that. And then it goes to the creating your home base section, which again, I really, really love. And they have features and drawbacks from these things, like the fact that, like, Ernie's Juice Bar, not only the Rangers are there, other people hang out. It's the community center. Technically, it was the community center, and Ernie's Juice Bar was inside the community center. So because of that, one of the drawbacks to Ernie's Juice Bar is it is exposed. So you have to be careful when the Rangers are hanging out there. They have to be careful about what they say, and they have to be careful about what they do. And if the bad guys understand that they hang out there, they may try to attack that, because it puts the Rangers at a disadvantage. And then there's also features like things like enriching, where it's just really, really nice or fun. It's a fun place to be, and so that has mechanical benefits whenever the Rangers have time to be there. And yeah, they talk about having multiple bases, and then they give some examples of different bases, like Reefside High, the Command Center, SPD's home base, Haley's Cyberspace, which was a cyber cafe, if I remember correctly. And then they introduced some team contacts, so more contacts that you can kind of call on when you need them. Then they introduced the downtime system, which I think fits really well with the Beneath the Helmet thing, because it's basically giving your players the ability to do things when they're not being Power Rangers, and how to kind of add mechanics that make sense and can reward players for doing downtime stuff. So yeah, like I said, this chapter is really, really dense, and there's a lot of stuff in there. But most of it, aside from the team power stuff, most of it is really good and really interesting. So, moving on. Chapter 2. Who wears the helmet? And I've just realized as I'm going to this is actually the player options chapter. This is where your new origins, your new influences, and new roles are all here. And they're exactly what you would expect. The new origins are new origins. They're interesting. They have cool lore behind them. And they change how you play the characters. So there's not a whole lot I can say about them. The 4 new influences I think are really interesting. There's an archaeologist influence. There's a checkered past influence, which I really, really like. There's a crowd pleaser influence, which is another one that I think is really fun. And then life interrupted influence. All of them being really interesting and definitely creating new ways to play the characters. And again, the nice thing about influences in Essence 20 in general is you are kind of expected to take multiple influences. And so they've only introduced 4 new influences, but when you combine those with the other influences that already exist, there's a ton of different combinations you can make that will turn this into something really, really interesting and fun. And then right after that, they have character motivations going beyond bonds. And this is a really, really great section for both players and game masters, where it really talks about the idea of motivation. Again, my background before getting into business, I was an actor. I was a really good actor. And the way I approached all of my roles was I was a very motivation influenced actor, where I would always look, what's motivating my characters. It was one of the first things that I learned in college was learning how to use motivations to kind of influence the choices that you make when you're acting. So I understand motivation really, really well. A lot of players don't. Again, I went to college for this stuff. And I spent like a decade of my life learning the craft of acting, and motivation is a huge, huge part of that. For people that don't want to spend a decade of your life learning how to be an actor just so they can play RPGs, this is a really, really great section. And it does talk about a lot of really interesting, complex things that are going to make the stories that you tell that much more interesting. So that in and of itself is probably the most valuable part of this book for players and to GMs, because again, talking about how to craft good motivations, how to use those motivations to make interesting choices when you're playing is not something that I've seen in any other tabletop RPG book. And so this is really, really nice. And then the very next section is we talk about the new roles. The new Dark Ranger role is interesting. Their main mechanic is what's called terror, which is basically when you deal damage or inflict a condition on another character as a result of a skill test you have edge on, you gain a terror point. You have a maximum amount of terror you can have at any particular time, and then the rest of the features of the Dark Ranger all use terror. The issue with that being you cannot get terror if you don't have an edge on your skill tests. So, and if you're not familiar with what edge is, it's advantage. From D&D 5th edition, they just call it edge. So you roll 2d20s, take the higher of the 2 rolls. So the Dark Ranger is really edge reliant. If they are not getting edge on their rolls, then they're not able to get their terror. And terror is accrued throughout the day. So anytime a new day starts, all your terror is gone. You have to start over again. So that's my only real issue with the Dark Ranger. It's an interesting concept in and of itself, and there's some interesting stuff that it can do, but it's really, really limited by the fact that the only way you can get terror until you are, I believe it's the Apex Dark Ranger, so level 20, is you have to have edge on your rolls. So you're constantly going to basically be doing anything you can to find a way to get edge. And then after that, we introduce the 2 alternate roles. You have the Aqua Ranger and the Graphite Ranger. And in addition to having the Graphite Ranger, they do also have the Silver Ranger reprinted so that you can kind of understand what you're supposed to be doing with it. And both of these are interesting, to say the least. Fun fact, for anyone that doesn't know, in Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, for the most part, the the Ranger colors are technically gender specific. And what I mean by that is, aside from a couple really rare instances, Red Rangers tend to be masculine or male. Blue Rangers tend to be masculine or male. Yellow Rangers in Sentai are male. Yellow Rangers in Power Rangers are generally female, with one exception. And so one of the interesting things is Blue Rangers is one of the roles that actually tends to flip-flop a little bit more than the other ones. And the interesting thing about it is anytime you have a female Blue Ranger, they actually have a different color suit than the male Blue Rangers. Male Blue Rangers have a dark blue color. Female Blue Rangers tend to have a light blue color or an aqua color. If you look at it like Billy, if you look at Billy versus Tori from Ninja Storm, Tori's blue is a light blue, whereas Billy's is a dark blue. And so the Aqua Ranger is effectively the female color version of the Blue Ranger. Now, nothing in the role links it to it being linked to any gender. I've always found it really fascinating that, in particular for Blue Rangers, female Blue Rangers always have a different color. Whereas everything else, like again, Yellow Rangers for the most part are male, but there have been female Yellow Rangers and they wear the same color, just Yellow Rangers, female Yellow Rangers have a skirt and male Yellow Rangers don't. And then the rest of them tend to be fairly gender specific. Like we've only had one female Red Ranger, which was in Cosmic Fury, and again, wore the same, technically it was a slightly different red color because they were different suits, but it was hardly noticeable, and it wasn't because she was the female version and she had a skirt. Everything else, if it's a female version of it, they just add a skirt to it, and that's all you need to do. And they actually kind of made light of it in Dino Fury, because Izzy, the Green Ranger in Dino Fury, in Real Soldier, which is the Sentai series, the Green Ranger is male, and so all of the Sentai footage does not have a skirt. And so in the first episode that Izzy morphs, she has a skirt because they filmed that in the US, and then she rips the skirt off so that she's just wearing kind of the normal Power Rangers outfit, and mentions that she hates skirts. And so I thought that was really funny, and it was kind of a nod to the idea that Power Rangers does tend to gender bend some of the things, particularly Yellow Rangers, because in Super Sentai, in general, you only have one female Ranger, and that's generally the Pink Ranger or the White Ranger, whereas in Power Rangers, they generally like to have at least two female Rangers. And so a lot of times they have to take a male Ranger. Like the original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the Yellow Ranger was a dude in Super Sentai, but it was a girl in Power Rangers. It was Trini. And so, yeah, she has no skirt, whereas Kimberly the Pink Ranger has a skirt. Anyway, so the Aqua Ranger is basically... the way that they kind of pitch it is the Aqua Ranger is more science focused, whereas the Blue Ranger is more technology focused. So a lot of the abilities that the Aqua Ranger replaces are things that will allow you to deal with nature and knowledge in general, as opposed to building things. And they do get some elemental abilities in there as well to kind of mimic a little more of the like Ninja Storm elemental things. And then same thing is true of the Silver Ranger. The Silver Ranger in the core Silver Ranger is kind of a paladin, for lack of a better term. But they also have this ability to kind of create weapons and items in the moment. So they're a very kind of adaptable ranger, and they get to do some really cool stuff. The graphite ranger, on the other hand, is significantly more focused on protection and brute force. And they kind of both fit the idea of a paladin, like, because you can play a paladin a couple different ways. You can play a paladin as a character that kind of fits a couple different roles. They can work as kind of an off healer. They can work a little bit as a tank. They can work as a damage dealer. They can do a lot of other things. Or your kind of more classic paladin is really heavy armor, big freaking shield, and they can take a lot of damage because they can heal themselves. And so basically you have your more adaptable, generalized Silver Ranger versus the Graphite Ranger, which is all about strength and protection. And both of them are really interesting. And again, one of the things I love about this is the fact that for the Aqua Ranger, they don't reprint the Blue Ranger in here because they're like, well, you need the core book to play, so you're going to have that. But for the Graphite Ranger, they have the Silver Ranger reprinted here, so you can actually make direct comparisons between the Silver Ranger and the Graphite Ranger without having to have two books open. And it does make it really interesting to see just how they kind of modify this. And again, for people that understand how to template, and when I say how to template, I'm basically talking about being able to look at a system and remove the specifics of it, but still keep the kind of basic template so that you can use it to make your own homebrew stuff. The Graphite Ranger versus the Silver Ranger is a perfect way to understand how to template these alternate versions of Rangers so that you can come up with some of your own. If we look at Ninja Storm, they actually had two different Red Rangers and two different Blue Rangers. Because the original Ninja Storms you had, or not two different Blue Rangers, they had, yeah, they did. So what it was, you had red, yellow, blue for the core Ninja Storm team. And then you had the Thunder Rangers. And there was a red Thunder Ranger and a blue Thunder Ranger. But they didn't want to kind of confuse everything, so you had the Red Thunder Ranger was the Crimson Ranger, and they had a much darker red. And the Blue Ranger for the Ninja Storm team was Tori. She was a female Blue Ranger, so she was already a very light blue. But what was even more interesting was the Blue Ranger for the Thunder Ninja Rangers. Wasn't your regular blue color that you would have for a Blue Ranger. They were the Navy Ranger, so they were even darker blue. So that in and of itself is really fascinating. Then they also had a Green Samurai Ranger who was super cool and vastly underutilized. So yeah, I really like these alternate Ranger things. Again, they remind me of 2nd edition kits, and I really love the kits from 2nd edition. It's not that I don't like subclasses, which is effectively what kits eventually became in 5th edition. But the idea of being able to take a base class and then just rip out a few sections of it and replace it with different ones to create effectively a different character class, but it still it builds upon things that already exist. I really like that. They did that in 4th edition as well, where you would have like 3 or 4 different versions of the fighter, and they all had different names. Like the Slayer was different than the Fighter. But they were still basically fighters. But because they had different powers and kind of different focuses, they played very, very differently. And I think this is cool. You effectively could have a Graphite Ranger and a Silver Ranger on the same team, and they would play very differently. Despite the fact that they're using similar mechanics, there's enough difference there that they would feel very different. And when you're looking at a season like Dino Charge and Super Dino Charge or Dino Supercharge, whichever it was, they had 10 different Rangers in that. So they did have, Koda was the Blue Ranger, and then they also had an Aqua Ranger that I can't remember who the Aqua Ranger was. So they had colors that were repeated on there, and they didn't feel strange or weird. It was a huge freaking cast, and every so often they would change powers, if I remember correctly, because a couple people were rangers for a little bit, like what was her name, Kendall became a ranger for a little bit and then wasn't a ranger anymore. So yeah, Dino Charge was a hell of a season. It really pushed Power Rangers further than it had in a long time. Also, Yoshi Sudarsu is probably one of the nicest people on the planet. And so anytime I can talk about the season that he was in positively, I'm going to, because I adore Yoshi Sudarsu. His brother Peter is also really cool, and he was the Blue Ranger for Ninja Storm, which is one of the reasons I love Ninja Storm or Ninja Steel. So yeah, like I said, both of them really interesting. And then we get roles and spectrum perks. So basically, in addition to having these completely alternate kits, effectively, they have these alternate spectrum perks, which is basically like Cyborg is a first level alternate spectrum perk, where you could take one of the first level perks you have on your character and replace it with Cyborg to kind of customize the character. All of the alternate spectrum perks, there's only 4 of them. All the alternate spectrum perks here happen either first or second level, which kind of fits in with the idea of your defining features, or what I call in my Essential Lessons 20 series, your table features or table perks. They should show up within the first 2 levels, and so that's what you have of here. And again, these are kind of alternate spectrum light. I don't think any of these, like, again, there's only 4 of them, but if you understand templating, you can use them to modify a lot of different things. And they don't all fit along a certain theme or something like that. Like, I couldn't see someone using every single one of these on a single character to try and make a new spectrum role. Like, they're unique enough. And again, there's 2 first level and there's 2 second levels, so you probably wouldn't be able to use all of them on a single character anyways. But yeah. And then they talk about the idea of form perks as this is spectrum perks. So if you wanted to add any of the new form perks that they put in here, you can effectively use them. Yeah, and they are general perks. So you could effectively use them as spectrum perks. So effectively replace either a first or a second level thing with a form perk to be able to make them something that was part of the characters right from the beginning without completely overbalancing. And again, if you're using the form perks as a way to kind of create a team bonus, that would effectively mean that some of the roles would lose a little bit of their originality in order to have this kind of cohesive form perk that all the Rangers get. I'm not particularly fond of that idea. Simply because, again, I like the things that make each one of the roles unique, and replacing them with a thing to make them more homogenous tends to kind of muddy the water. Now, again, the Power Rangers RPG system is kind of a hybrid class-based and skill-based RPG, because while yes, you do have your roles, which are effectively your classes, Power Rangers specifically, unlike G.I. Joe and Transformers, where you have your focuses, basically your subclasses, there's no subclasses in Power Rangers RPG. You are it is expected that through the general perks that you choose and your grid powers that you choose, that is how you're going to customize your character to create something unique. Yeah, I mean, Power Rangers is already kind of built around the idea that you're going to be making a unique ranger on your own, and the roles are a little bit less defining than they are in the other Essence to 20 giga games. But yeah, I'm not 100%. I'm not 100% sold on it. They do introduce a couple new general perks. One of my favorite, chivalrous. You're just a very chivalrous person, and it lets you do some cool stuff for the privilege general perk, which I find hilarious. And then they introduce the new form perks. They have a Beast Morpher form perk, which is basically, if you've watched we'll try this one more time. If you've watched Beast Morphers at all, each one of the core Beast Morphers has a specific animal DNA that is infused into them to turn them into Power Rangers. And because of it, they have a special ability built in. So like there's Cheetah, Gorilla, and Jackrabbit. That is all they give examples for. So this is literally just being able to recreate the Beast Morphers. For the Dino Thunder forms, again, Dino Thunder, each one of the Energems actually came with a personal power that they could use outside of morphing. And they do introduce that here. And they have a lot more form perks here than they do for the Beast Morphers. They have aura reading, camouflage, invisibility, mind reading, Terra screen, replication, shield propulsion, T-Rex speed, Triceratops skin. Like, I believe the Rangers had like a couple different versions of these things, but whatever. There's a lot more that you can do with the Dino Thunder forms than they give you with the Beast Morpher forms. And then the Ninja Storm Wind Ranger forms are, again, just literally replicating the things that the Ninja Storm Rangers could do. So they have air, earth, and water. They don't even go into the Thunder Rangers. So you have that, and again, I'm not 100% sold on them. I like the form perks, and I think they can be kind of interesting. The fact that they've now kind of tied them into Spectrum perks and into Team perks, it gets a little bit money for my taste. Then right after that, they introduced some new grid powers. A lot of the grid powers are tied to the new Energems and Dino Chargers. And things like that. They also have new Zord powers as well that are tied very closely to the new Dino Charger system, which again, to me, just starts getting a little bit too complicated for its own good. You know, if you think that the players don't have enough grid powers, then just do an errata where you increase the amount of grid powers, or give the players the ability to get all of their grid power back on a short rest instead of a limited amount, or a long rest instead of a limited amount. Things like that. This starts getting a little bit nuts. They introduced some new contacts, including Professor Tommy Oliver, which is a really badass contact. One of his contact perks is called Soul of the Dragon. And if you don't know what that's a reference to, you need to check out the comic books. There's an entire, I think it was a miniseries called Soul of the Dragon that was all about old Tommy and him dealing with basically the last time he gets to use his powers and that. Like, it's really good. So yeah, and so that is chapter 2. Moving on. Chapter 3. Helmets, Morphers, and more. This is some new gear that they introduce. And they introduce some new kits, which are fine. Kits in this are just a collection of items that you can use for skill checks, like a hacker rig. More than just a mobile computer, a hacker rig is a custom modified portable machine designed to get around security programs and access places that the public was not meant to see. So basically you have a little thing that you use to hack and stuff like that. So they have those. However, this is where they introduce the Energens, the Dino Drives, and Dino Tutorchargers. And again, basically what this is it's a really complicated way to give players additional personal power through the use of these Dino Tutorchargers. And again, at this point, it feels like complexity for complexity's sake. There's a definite lore reason why. When you look at Dino Charge, like they use these Dino Chargers all the time, and it became an ongoing gimmick starting with the I think it was the Neo, no, not the Neo Saban, just after the Neo Saban era. I think it started with technically kind of Mega Force, which was Neo Saban, but it definitely became much more common with Dino Charge and then Ninja Steel. Then Beast Morphers didn't do it as much, and then it was crazy prevalent in Dino Fury, where they would have these little things that would basically just give them extra powers at any given time. So in Dino Charge, it was Dino Chargers. In Ninja Steels, they had Ninja Stars that they'd put on their sword and they'd spit it, and it would give them some new thing, like the Metal Ninja Star, and they'd spit it and they could do all these cool like cutty things, or the Speed Ninja Star, and they do all this stuff. When you get to Dino Fury, they have all these different keys that they use that give them just tons and tons and tons of different attachments and new weapons and stuff like that. And that's basically been the gimmick of Power Rangers for the past few series, has been this idea of, well, yeah, you're Power Rangers, but you also have all these extra things. And so, yeah, I understand that the Dino Chargers were effectively one of the first versions of that gimmick of, hey, in addition to you being Power Rangers, we're just going to give you a plethora of extra gear that you can summon randomly. So I get the lore reason why they introduced them, but the actual mechanical benefit is you get 4 extra personal power. And that's it. So it's just giving you extra personal power. Now, a lot of that is because all of the new stuff that they introduce in here requires personal power. And so without Dino Chargers, a lot of it becomes significantly less useful because you simply just don't have enough personal power to be able to do it in the base game. So again, I understand the need to increase power because this particular thing is going to just use a lot more power. But it's not, I'm not particularly fond of it. Again, this feels like complexity for complexity's sake. And then again, they give a bunch of new weapon examples, like the Terra Grips or the Tricera Shield, you know, stuff from Dino, was it Dino Thunder? Is that what it is? Abba Ranger. And Dino Charge. So stuff like that. They introduced a couple new battleizers, which I'm a huge fan of battleizers in general. They have the Red Fury mode, Dino Supercharge mode, and then the Triassic battleizer. All of them really cool. I love battleizers. I think they were one of the coolest things. They were first introduced in Power Rangers in Space, and I think the first battleizer might have been U.S. Exclusive. I can't actually remember if in Mega Ranger if they had a battleizer for the Red Ranger, but it eventually became. It used to be exclusively a Red Ranger thing. Like every season, the Red Ranger would get a battleizer, and then they started giving other colors battleizers as well. And I just think battleizers are super fun. They introduced a couple new vehicles, including Raptor Riders, which look cool. It's just a little dinosaur, little mechanical dinosaur that you get to ride. And then the new Zord and new Zord features, which are almost exclusively involving Dino Gem integration. So being able to use the new Dino Chargers and Energems and things like that. And again, the Dino Gem integration is a little bit weird because the integration gives you a downshift to your targeting on one of the Zord's ranged energy attacks, but then it also lets you change the energy type of that attack based on your spectrum. And it just doesn't seem like there's a real benefit to it. But maybe I'm just forgetting how Zord attacks work. And then, yeah, like I said, they do have something that's kind of interesting called Megaform Signature Finishing Mood, which is basically when you take this Zord perk, you basically get to design, the final attack for your Megazord. And only one person has to take the Megaform Signature Finishing Move in order for your Megazord to have access to it. Which, again, is something that's a little bit weird. The fact that they're tying it to a particular thing means effectively you have to sacrifice one of your Zord perks to do something that's going to benefit all of them instead of something that just benefits you. So that in and of itself is a little bit weird, but it is Power Rangers. You are meant to be a team anyways, so... yeah, and then they talk about the alternate Megaform combinations. And they specifically said, note that this rule set is not intended to allow Rangers to create multiple Megaforms from a single team of Rangers, unless the powers of the morphing grid determine such a need is great indeed, and the GM approves. So you can use this alternate thing to have basically different versions of the Megazord, but it's not really designed for that. What it's designed to do is basically to allow you to build a Megazord when you don't have the entire team there. So yeah. And then again, they have all the different Zords from Dino Thunder and then from Dino Charge, which there were a lot of Zords in Dino Charge because there was about 11 billion Dino Rangers. And they do have, in here, they do have Dino Charge Megazord, Stegoraptor formation, Pararaptor formation, Parastego formation, Ankylo Pachy formation. So they do have that kind of thing where you have different flavors depending on which Zords are a part of it. Like I said, the thing that I liked about Ninja Steel specifically is you could have all of the Zords there, but you would shift around who is effectively in the driving seat to create different flavors. But it's the same basic principle here. They just, in this one, they do it by having just different Zords join, as opposed to having a different Zord in the driver's seat. But it's the same basic principle, and again, if you understand templating, you can come up with your own stuff, which I think is really interesting. So, yeah, moving on. Chapter 4. Challenges a flying kick can't solve. This is your GM section that's specifically tailored towards the idea of how do I write interesting, compelling stories for the players when they're not being Power Rangers. How do I balance them being students or having day jobs or whatever with also being superheroes? And it's a really well-written section. Again, this is useful outside of the Power Rangers RPG. Even in like Dungeons and Dragons, where your job is adventurer, using the tips that they have here to basically intertwine backstories and the people that knew the player characters before they became adventurers is something that's interesting and unique and fun. They talk about how to kind of set up the alter ego stuff right in session 0. They talk about pacing and how to create they call them mundane story arcs and how to do development and stuff like that. And yeah, it's just, without getting into too many specifics, it's really, really interesting. They have 2 example mundane arcs. One is called Save Reefside Park, which is an extremely common thing you see in the Power Rangers TV series. Like, they'll have for an episode, we need to save the youth center because, they're running out of money, or we need to save this orphanage because they're doing this. And while, the world isn't going to end if they don't do it, it's a really important thing to the characters themselves. The other example art is My Dad the Dinosaur, which is specifically about the idea of Trent, who is the white Dino Thunder Ranger. His father, Anton Mercer, is also Mesogog. They share the same body, and it's an interesting plot thing. Dino Thunder was a phenomenal Power Rangers as a series. Like, it was really, really well written. And they dealt with, there was a lot of callbacks to earlier Power Rangers, specifically the idea of Trent starting out as a bad guy and then becoming a good guy, mimicked Tommy's journey as well, of starting out as the evil Green Ranger and then becoming the good Green Ranger. And the fact that Tommy was a part of it, there was a really cool dynamic between Tommy and Trent. So yeah. And then they talk about, tips for building NPCs and how to do them. Again, they have a section called Show Don't Tell, which is unbelievably essential. Current writers in Hollywood need to read this section because they're really good at telling you what's happening. They're horrible at showing it. Yeah, like I said, I can't really go into too much detail without giving too much away in this section, or without just like reading parts of it. But it's really, really good advice for just GMs in general. And there's a lot of generic stuff like how to build NPCs and how many NPCs to have and how to introduce them. There's an entire section on threatening their home base. They had that whole section where you build their home base, and now they have a section on attacking the home base, and how to make that feel important and life-changing without making it feel unfair or like a sucker punch. Something like that. It's like, well, this is supposed to be our safe haven, and now you're just making enemies in there. So they have all these tips on how to make that a really successful thing. They have a downtime section talking about stuff that can happen there, and how the players can use downtime and stuff. And then they have technically a threat section, but they are all non-combat threats, like an anti-ranger politician. Effectively someone that goes, who are these vigilantes? They don't answer to anyone. Every time they show up, they destroy half of downtown. We need to arrest the Power Rangers because of all the bad stuff that they've done that they've never paid for. Stuff like that. That can be a really, really fun, infuriating plot to deal with as Power Rangers, because as the Power Rangers, you're going like, hey, I'm saving the world here. And you have this person who actually has a lot of power. Politicians in general, they wield a lot of power and they can make the Rangers' life miserable, but the Rangers can't use their powers against them. They can't just morph and deal with them because they're not bad guys, or they're not, evil space aliens. They're just bad people. They also have a bully stat block, and all the stuff about how to run bullies, which is, again, is another really frustrating thing when you're a superhero and you still have to deal with bullies, because a lot of times, depending on the bullies that you're dealing with, they will, especially television bullies, they will use physical force as a way to get what they want. And for Power Rangers in particular, if they morph, the bullies can't touch them, and the Power Rangers could instantly take out the bullies, but they can't do that again because the bullies aren't evil space aliens. They're just bad guys. And it wouldn't be fair to use their powers against them. So, yeah. Callous business people, a con artist, that's another one that could be really, really fun to throw at the players, is have one of them get conned and have to deal with that while also dealing with saving the world. And then corrupt authority, cultists, another one that's really weird. Government agents, when the government doesn't like you. Lawless figure, if you want a kind of anti-hero thing that you have to deal with. Poachers, teachers, as their own little foils. Especially since, like, a lot of my friends were education majors, became teachers. I have a decent amount of respect for teachers, but I lost a lot of respect for teachers when they started complaining about how little they were paid. And then I would go, hey, listen, I've got a degree too, and I get paid half of what you get paid and don't get benefits. And I don't get 3 months a year off. And especially, growing up, there were really awesome teachers. Again, one of my band directors became a pretty close friend by the time I graduated, and I stayed in contact with him afterwards because he was such an amazing dude and he had such a huge impact on my life. Whereas I had another teacher, I kid you not, this literally happened to me. And the weird thing was, this teacher, she was an English teacher. She taught the AP English class, and I was in the AP English class because I was smarter than most Americans. That's not saying much, folks. It was public school. Her husband was a social studies teacher that everybody hated because if you got a perfect score on everything in his class, you got a B. And the reason why was he said getting an A requires extra effort. So if you want to have an A in my class, not only do you have to do well in the class, you have to do some extra credit project in order to be able to get an A in this class. And people hated him for that because he really challenged the students. Like my freshman government course, I had to memorize the entire presidential cabinet of it was George W. Bush when I was in high school, and so I had to memorize his entire cabinet that year, and I did. I knew the entire cabinet for like a couple years. Now, unfortunately for me, presidential cabinets change like at the drop of a hat, so it wasn't super useful information for too long, but it was weird. I had the utmost respect for her husband. Could not stand the English teacher, and they will remain nameless because I don't want to call them out. But I had this thing where I got, I was, my senior year, I was the assistant director of the fall musical. We were doing Les Mis because we were crazy, and I was also playing Javert. I also had my conversion disorder was already showing up. It'd been conversion disorder had been an issue since I was in the 5th grade. It didn't get diagnosed until I was in my mid-20s. But I would get sick and I would miss school a lot due to I would get unexplained tremors. I would get massively sick to my stomach. Like you name it, bad things would happen to me. And so one day I missed school because I was massively sick. I think I even tried to attend school. I made it like an hour or two and then went to the nurse's office and had them call my folks and said, I can't stay here anymore. I'm too sick. I can't do this. I think I got a migraine or something like that. So by the time school was over, because again, a lot of these illnesses were anxiety based, I was feeling better and we had rehearsal that night. And because not only was I the assistant director, but I was also one of the leads. If I didn't show up to rehearsal, there were certain things that just wouldn't get done. If I didn't show up to class, nothing changed. The teacher taught the same lesson plan or anything. But if I didn't show up to rehearsal, people couldn't rehearse certain scenes. And so I wasn't feeling great, but I felt good enough to be able to go to rehearsal, and I took it kind of light. Well, the next day, I come into class, and I get chewed out royally. She is pissed off at me. She's staring daggers at me the entire class period. And I can't understand why she keeps singling me out and making these quips. Like, she was massively passive aggressive about it. And so at the end of class, I go, what's going on? And she's like, so you can't come to my class, but you can go to rehearsal? Said, yeah. Like, without missing a beat, I'm like, yeah. I was feeling better by then. It's like, well, that's just, and she couldn't understand, like, she was expecting me to be like bashful, like, oh, well, I didn't think you noticed. I'm like, no, yeah. She said, well, why? I said, because I'm a lead in the role, in the show, and I'm the assistant director. If I don't show up, they can't rehearse certain things. If I don't show up to your class, nothing changes. Everyone else can still learn the exact same thing. And the only way, the only justification, because she was still mad and she didn't accept that. She didn't think that was a valid reason for me to go to rehearsal. And she goes, well, how do you think I feel? how do you think that made me feel that you're willing to go to rehearsal, but you're not willing to show up to my class? And I didn't say this, but I thought it, because I knew that if I said this, it would be bad. Well, it's not my job to make you feel good. You're a teacher. You shouldn't be looking at your students to make you feel good. In fact, teachers that rely on their students to make them feel good generally have large problems and end up in prison, if you get my drift. But she was just so incredibly arrogant and entitled that somehow, like, she was doing this amazing thing. Her class was unbelievably boring. I hated English classes because, first of all, I spoke English better than most of my teachers. And the reason I spoke English better than most of my teachers is because I took French. I learned very little about English in English class. And the AP tests in general were really boring because I had to, like, it was AP English was mostly about reading comprehension, which I was already better at than most of my peers, and it was dumb. And I didn't enjoy school in general, with a few rare exceptions. And so this idea that she was doing this amazing, wonderful thing and imparting her knowledge to us, and it didn't. And I did really well in the AP English test. I think I got a 4, and on AP tests you get 1 to 5. A 3 is considered passing, 4 is considered really good, 5 is basically, why are you taking this? You should be teaching it. So I got a 4 on it. When I got to college, it got me nothing. I still had to take the stupid freshman English course that I slept through and still passed with flying colors. So anyway, the idea of a teacher being a possible threat. Because again, you can have good teachers that just don't understand that the characters are Power Rangers, and they see them kind of slipping in their grades and stuff like that because they're saving the world in their off time, and they get really they think that they're helping by going, hey, I don't know what's going on in the rest of your life, but you really need to focus here. You're going to screw up the rest of your life. You're not going to be able to get into a good school. You're not going to be able to get a good career. You know, that kind of teacher. And then you can also have the super entitled, arrogant teachers that take things personally, both of which can be really, really frustrating threats for superheroes to deal with, because all of their superhero powers are completely useless to someone who has the ability to send you to detention and either suspend or expel you, which could affect the rest of your life after you're done saving the world that no one can ever know about. So I love stuff like that. So yeah, that's chapter 4. Moving on. Chapter 5. Threats. Now, normally the threats chapter is exactly that. It's just a monster manual. This one actually has some pretty interesting advice on the idea of, you know, your villain of the week versus your lieutenants and stuff like that. In Power Rangers in general, every episode they would have a new villain of the week. They would have a new monster they have to deal with, and so the players are generally not going to be super emotionally invested, or the audience is not going to be super emotionally invested in any of the monsters of the week. However, excuse me, man, I got something on my nose and it's driving me nuts. However, they also have these lieutenants that, as Power Rangers became more and more complex, started playing bigger and bigger roles and having much more emotional impact. But even the original lieutenant of Goldar, he and Jason had a rivalry. And so every time Goldar would show up, there was an investment in there, and we would get really, really invested. There's one episode where Goldar actually kidnapped Jason and put him basically in a box. That's all it was. It was called like the Dark Dimension or something like that. But it was just a decent sized box with dry ice smoke on the bottom of it. And so there's an entire thing because they kidnapped the Red Ranger to basically prevent the Rangers from having their leader, and then the Rangers had to fight without Jason, while Jason was trapped in there with Goldar, and Goldar had his Morpher. And so Jason couldn't morph to fight Goldar, and it was a really, really cool scene where Goldar's trying to kill him effectively, and Jason's doing everything he can to hide until he can get his morpher back, and it's a really, really cool scene. So they do talk about the idea of your monster of the week, villain of the month, and how your recurring villains need to show up frequently enough that the players care about them, but not so frequently that they're upstaging your monster of the week types of stuff, which I think is really, really cool. And then they just have kind of tips on how to create interesting relationships with the rogues gallery and the players. And then we just have the threats themselves. So you start with the minions, and they actually do them in a specific order. They start with Mesogog, which is Dino Thunder, and then they do Sledge, which is Dino Charge, and then the third one, which is Dino Supercharge. And so instead of everything being in alphabetical order, it basically takes you through the 3 different eras, effectively. So you start off with Mesogog's Tyrannodrone, which were their version of putties. And then they have a few different monsters of the week. Some of them, like, one of them is called the Jade Gladiator. It is the coolest, most badass looking monster I have ever seen. It looks like, if you ever saw the anime Ronin Warriors, it looks like a supercharged version of Sage, the Green Ronin Warrior. And instead of a massive sword, it has this really cool bow. Like, I don't know what episode the Jade Gladiator showed up in, or if it was just a comic book thing, but it is a massively cool looking monster. And then it has more kind of traditional looking, weird ass monsters going through there. They even have evil Zords for that. And then they get to the lieutenants, and then Mesogog and who was it? Zeltrax, who I guess is a lieutenant. And then it goes to Sledge, and you start with your minions, which were the Vivix, and then your monsters of the week, and then lieutenants of Doomwing, Fury, Poisandra, and Wrench, and then you have Sledge himself, and then Snide, who became the villain the later half of Dino Charge and I think Dino Supercharge, and then who was it? Lord Arcanas, which was also Dino Supercharge if I remember correctly. Yeah. So that's the end of the threat section. Moving on to final thoughts. Overall, there is so much to love about this book. There are just tons and tons and tons of character options. There's quite a few different things in here that if you're good at templating, you can use it to homebrew a lot of different stuff for the Power Rangers RPG. The new threats are really interesting. The new influences and origins are really, really fun and interesting. The Dark Ranger role is a bit sketchy with how reliant it is on Edge. Other than that, it's kind of cool. And both the Aqua Ranger and the Graphite Ranger, I think, are really, really interesting. However, this book, at this point, has crossed the line. I mentioned before in the Factions G.I. Joe book that Power Rangers was, or Essence 20 was starting to flirt with being too complex to be good, and the idea of complexity for complexity's sake. This is where I feel like they start crossing that line. The new team powers, the new form powers that are tied to spectrum perks and stuff like that. Now it's starting to become a little bit overwhelming, and it starts to create the same problem that Pathfinder had, that D&D 3.5 had, that GURPS still has, where you have a completely different game depending on which sources you allow to use. Whereas something like D&D 5th edition, If you allow all official sources, the game doesn't change that much. It's still the same basic game. They just have a lot more options to choose. Whereas with the fact that every single time they put a new book out, they're introducing a new mechanic, you're now getting to the point where playing with this book specifically massively changes how your rangers interact. Much more so than any other book. And I don't think that's a good thing. Do I think that the book is bad? No. I've recommended everyone pick it up because I think it's really, really great. But it worries me what's going to happen in the future with, again, if we see a Ninja Steel book or a Dino Fury book, are they going to add another system on top of this to make it even more complex to the point where you cannot ever use all the options available to you because it would just make the game too complicated? We don't really know. But yeah, if anyone from Renegade is watching this, maybe think about, instead of introducing new systems, embellishing old systems, which I guess technically they build upon form perks and stuff like that in here, but Essence 20 is already a really robust system that has enough here to be very, very customizable. I just don't really enjoy having this many more systems. Like, I would be just as happy with this book if all it did was introduce new character options and didn't introduce a brand new team power system. In fact, I'd probably be a little bit more excited. And if I was to resurrect my Power Rangers mini Kika campaign, I probably would not use the team powers, just because, again, it makes it a little bit overwhelming for me. So aside from the game starting to add a little bit of complexity for complexity's sake, it's a really solid book. There's a lot here compared to some of the other source books that we've gotten that really didn't add a ton. This one almost feels like it should have been two different books with how much stuff is in here, and might actually have benefited specifically for the team powers, because again, they're really poorly explained in here, which is kind of a theme for Renegade. It might have benefited from kind of splitting them into maybe like Dino Thunder and Ninja Storm in this book, and then going to Dino Charge and Super Dino Charge in another book might have worked slightly better. Who knows? It's still a good book. I still enjoyed it. However, that is going to be all for me today. As always, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon to turn notifications on. All those things are super, super important. In the comments down below, what is your opinion about or civilian powers in Power Rangers? They've had it a few times. The Mystic Force actually could use magic when they weren't morphed. Dino Thunder, each one of the Energems came with its own personal power. SPD, they all had mutations that they could use. So what are your opinions on civilian powers in Power Rangers? Do you like the idea that the Power Rangers, even in their civilian mode, are still kind of superhuman? Or are you more like me, where you kind of enjoy the fact that when they're not morphed, they're just regular everyday people that have to deal with regular everyday things? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, that is all for me today. I will see you guys in the next time. All right? Bye-bye.